Jensen Huang's story doesn't begin with billion-dollar data centers or AI supercomputers. It begins in Taiwan, in the quiet spaces of a childhood shaped by modest means and the slow rhythm of a world still opening to him. When his family made the uncertain leap to the United States, nothing about the transition resembled the arc of a future tech icon. The early years were defined by dishwashing shifts, shared rooms, and a sense of starting from zero, a reality that teaches discipline long before ambition has the chance to grow. Yet within those constraints, something essential formed, a deep curiosity about how things work, and a steady, almost meditative patience with complexity. Jensen wasn't driven by theatrics or bravado. He was shaped by environments where endurance mattered more than speed, and where problems became puzzles rather than obstacles. This engineering mindset, calm, methodical, endlessly inquisitive, would become the thread that connected every chapter of his life. As he moved through school, one truth became clear. He wasn't just learning engineering. He was learning how to think with structure, how to break down chaos into patterns, how to push forward even when the outcome was uncertain. These skills weren't loud or flashy, but they would later become the foundation of one of the boldest technological gambles in modern business. Because when NVIDIA entered the picture, the world wasn't waiting for it. There was no clear market, no consensus, no grand chorus predicting a revolution in graphics or accelerated computing. What existed was a belief, held by a small group of founders, anchored by Jensen, that the future would demand a different kind of computation, one that could parallelize the world's complexity instead of forcing it through narrow, sequential pipes. This is where the story becomes more than a biography. It becomes a blueprint for understanding how technological eras shift, how industries miss the signals that only a few individuals are disciplined enough to see, and how a company born in a diner could grow into the backbone of artificial intelligence, robotics, scientific research, and global infrastructure. Over the next few chapters, we'll explore how Jensen's philosophy, quiet, consistent, and relentlessly long-term, allowed NVIDIA to make decisions that looked irrational at the time, but foundational in hindsight. Decisions that would reshape computing far beyond gaming, and eventually redefine the trajectory of AI itself. And if this perspective helps you see the strategic logic behind today's most powerful technologies, consider subscribing. The deeper we understand these stories, the clearer the future becomes. Jensen Huang's early life doesn't follow the polished arc we often attach to successful founders. It begins in Taiwan, in a home shaped by pragmatism and quiet resilience. His family lives simply, surrounded by the constraints of a country still rebuilding its identity. Yet even in those early years, Jensen showed signs of a mind drawn toward structure, taking things apart, observing patterns, asking questions others didn't think to ask. These weren't the traits of a prodigy. They were the habits of someone who trusted curiosity more than comfort. When his parents decided to move to the United States, it wasn't for opportunity in the cinematic sense. It was survival, stability, a chance to anchor their children somewhere with more predictable outcomes. But the transition was anything but smooth. Jensen and his brother found themselves in environments that demanded humility. Dishwashing at a local restaurant, living in shared quarters, learning English through repetition and necessity. These experiences didn't build ego, they built endurance. What stands out from this period is how Jensen processed difficulty. Many children internalize hardship as limitation. Jensen used it as a form of calibration. Every long shift, every moment of uncertainty, helped refine an internal model. Success wouldn't come through shortcuts or noise. It would come through patience, discipline, and the ability to stay composed when the world around him was anything but.
Over time, this mindset aligned naturally with engineering,
Jensen wasn't mesmerized by machines for their aesthetics. He was drawn to the logic beneath them. He approached problems with an unusual calm, breaking them into smaller, solvable units, reassembling them in ways that revealed new possibilities. Teachers noticed a student who didn't rush, who didn't fear complexity, who treated each challenge like a quiet conversation rather than a battle. This way of thinking would become his most defining asset. Before NVIDIA, before GPUs, before AI, Jensen was learning how to navigate ambiguity without losing direction. He was learning that hard problems reward methodical thinkers. And he was learning the subtle difference between working fast and working with intention, a distinction that would later shape NVIDIA's execution style. What many people misunderstand is that greatness is often forged long before anyone is paying attention. Jensen's early years weren't glamorous, but they built the mental architecture required to survive a decade of failures, doubts, and industry skepticism. Those nights washing dishes didn't predict his future. They prepared him for it. By the time he entered the world of professional engineering, Jensen carried with him a rare blend of endurance and analytical depth. He understood struggle, but more importantly, he understood how to think his way through it. That combination would soon set the stage for one of the boldest bets in Silicon Valley. The story of NVIDIA's founding in 1993 doesn't begin with a polished pitch deck or a well-funded office. It begins in a small roadside diner where three engineers, Jensen Huang, Chris Malachowski, and Curtis Preem, met to discuss an idea so uncertain that most investors wouldn't have taken the meeting. At the time, the market for 3D graphics was fragmented, unreliable, and largely considered a niche. No one saw a billion-dollar opportunity. No one believed 3D chips would fuel an entire industry. And yet, this is where Jensen made the kind of decision that defines destinies. He bet on a future that only he could see. What makes this moment remarkable is how disproportionate the risk was compared to the clarity available. The world didn't need 3D graphics. Video games were primitive. Professional visualization tools were expensive and slow. And general-purpose computing dominated everything. But Jensen believed computation was about to evolve, that parallel graphics processors could eventually handle workloads that CPUs were never designed for. It wasn't a widely accepted thesis. It wasn't even a coherent industry trend. It was a hypothesis, supported by instinct and engineering intuition more than market data. In those early weeks, the founders operated without an office, without guaranteed funding, and without a clear product roadmap. They had conviction, sketches, and the shared belief that something important was hidden in the rising complexity of visual information. And it was Jensen who took the largest personal leap. While others debated the practicality of building a company in such a volatile space, he mortgaged his personal assets to keep the idea alive. This wasn't symbolic. It was literal skin in the game, the kind of commitment that signals two things: belief in the mission and willingness to absorb the consequences if it failed. Investors were hesitant, and understandably so. Hardware companies struggled to survive. Graphics lacked stable demand, and the infrastructure required to build chips was expensive, unforgiving, and full of failure points. But Jensen's pitch wasn't about short-term wins. It was about a long-term shift in how computation would work. He argued that graphics processors could eventually unlock new forms of visual realism, scientific simulation, and even new categories of software. In hindsight, this sounds prophetic. At the time, it sounded implausible. What kept the idea alive was the founders' ability to align around a unified strategy. Move fast, stay lean, and build a chip designed for a future that didn't yet exist. It was a difficult path, filled with more questions than answers. They worked in tight cycles, forcing small breakthroughs while absorbing constant setbacks. And through it all, Jensen remained unnervingly steady. Not optimistic in the motivational sense, but disciplined in the engineering sense. Every problem was solvable if broken down correctly. Every failure was simply data for the next iteration.
Looking back, the founding of NVIDIA wasn't a typical startup creation story. It was an improbable bet against an immature market, held together by conviction and an unshakable understanding of where technology was headed. Jensen didn't just launch a company, he placed a calculated wager on the evolution of computing itself. And as the world would soon discover, that wager was only the beginning of a much larger transformation. Before NVIDIA became synonymous with cutting-edge graphics, the company went through a stretch defined almost entirely by failure. The early chips didn't perform as expected. Designs were scrapped, timelines slipped. For many young hardware companies, this phase is fatal, the point where funding dries up and conviction quietly fades. But for Jensen, these setbacks served a different purpose. They were proof that the idea was worth pursuing, because the difficulty confirmed that no one else had solved the problem either. In the mid-1990s, the graphics market was still unpredictable. Gamers wanted better visuals, but the demand wasn't yet stable. Developers wanted more power, but the tools were fragmented. And competitors were fighting to survive with incremental improvements, not breakthroughs. NVIDIA's early products, NV1, NV2, stumbled for reasons that would have broken a less disciplined team. But those missteps revealed something Jensen understood deeply. Iteration is not a cost, it's an asset. When others slowed down to rethink strategy, NVIDIA pushed forward. Release, test, fail, redesign. The cycle became cultural. The turning point arrived with the RIVA series. It wasn't born from a single stroke of genius. It emerged from relentless adjustment. The team studied every failure, every inefficiency, every misalignment between hardware and software. They identified gaming as the first market where 3D graphics could scale, not because it was glamorous, but because gamers consistently demanded better performance and were willing to adopt new hardware quickly. This insight gave NVIDIA its first real foothold. RIVA 128, introduced in 1997, demonstrated what NVIDIA had been working toward: a fast, reliable, and accessible GPU that developers could trust. For the first time, NVIDIA wasn't reacting to the market. The market was starting to react to NVIDIA. The success of RIVA validated the company's belief that 3D graphics weren't a side category. They were a frontier. And they proved something deeper: that speed of execution could outmaneuver companies with larger budgets or longer histories. Inside NVIDIA, a philosophy was taking shape, not through slogans, but through experience. Perfect planning was overrated. Fast learning was indispensable. Jensen encouraged a mindset where teams moved quickly, accepted imperfection, and treated failure as a diagnostic tool rather than a setback. This wasn't recklessness. It was structured iteration. And in an industry where hardware cycles were slow, NVIDIA's pace began to feel almost unnatural. As the gaming era expanded, NVIDIA positioned itself not just as a chip maker, but as a company capable of predicting what developers and consumers would need before they asked for it. The success of RIVA didn't just stabilize the company. It became proof that NVIDIA's process worked. It was a signal that bold bets, when supported by relentless iteration, could reshape entire markets. And yet, even with this success, Jensen was already looking beyond gaming. He understood that graphics were only the first chapter. The real transformation, the one that would redefine NVIDIA's purpose, was still years away. But the lessons learned during the RIVA era would become the engine behind every breakthrough that followed. By the early 2000s, NVIDIA had secured its place in the gaming world. But Jensen Huang was already staring at a horizon no one else was thinking about. GPUs were powerful, yes, but they were locked inside a narrow industry, limited to drawing pixels for games and visual applications. Jensen believed that these chips contained something far more valuable: a new way to compute. And this belief would lead to one of the most controversial and expensive decisions in NVIDIA's history: the creation of CUDA. CUDA was not a product, it was a philosophy. The idea was simple in concept,
but radical in practice. Turn the GPU into a fully programmable processor. Allow developers to use it not just for graphics, but for scientific computing, physics simulations, financial modeling, anything demanding massive parallelism. It meant rewriting the relationship between hardware and software. It meant challenging decades of CPU-centric thinking. And it meant convincing developers to adopt a new model of computation, with no guarantee they would. Internally, the plan sounded almost unreasonable. Why invest hundreds of millions of dollars into a platform when the existing business, gaming, was already profitable and stable? Why fix a model that wasn't broken? Critics inside and outside the company argued that CUDA was a distraction at best and a waste of resources at worst. The market didn't ask for it. Developers didn't demand it. And no one believed GPU computing would ever challenge the dominance of CPUs. But Jensen wasn't optimizing for what the market wanted in 2006. He was optimizing for what the world would need in 2016 and beyond. He saw that the growth of data, complexity, and computational workloads was outpacing the architecture of traditional processors. He believed parallel computing would become the foundation of the next era. He saw that science, simulation, and emerging fields like machine learning would eventually require enormous computational throughput that CPUs simply couldn't provide. CUDA wasn't a gamble, it was preparation. The investment was staggering. NVIDIA poured talent, capital, and time into building a programming ecosystem that could survive in a world dominated by x86 architecture. The team had to design compilers, libraries, developer tools, documentation, training, and an entirely new development workflow. They needed to convince researchers, universities, and labs to trust an unproven computing model. CUDA required a belief not just in the product, but in the future of computation itself. The early years were quiet. Adoption was slow. Critics pointed to the lack of immediate returns as evidence that NVIDIA had overreached. But Jensen remained composed, as if he were waiting for a signal the rest of the world hadn't yet detected. He understood that some bets require patience measured in years, not quarters. He trusted that once developers experienced the parallel power of GPUs, the momentum would shift. Then, gradually, it did. Researchers in fields like physics, chemistry, deep learning, and robotics began experimenting with CUDA, discovering dramatic speedups in computation. Workloads that took days on CPUs could run in hours or minutes on NVIDIA GPUs. And for the first time, the world glimpsed the beginning of a new computing era, one where the GPU wasn't an accessory, but the engine. In hindsight, the creation of CUDA looks like destiny. But in the moment, it was a masterstroke of long-term thinking, a bet on an invisible trend that only a few could see. Jensen didn't just redefine the GPU, he redefined NVIDIA's identity. CUDA transformed the company from a chipmaker into a full-stack computing ecosystem. And when the rise of AI arrived years later, NVIDIA would be the only company truly prepared for it. This decision, bold, expensive, and deeply misunderstood, became the foundation of the modern AI revolution. And it proved something essential about Jensen's leadership. He wasn't building for the next product cycle. He was building for the next era of computation. By the time CUDA began gaining traction, something deeper was becoming visible inside NVIDIA. A philosophy that tied every decision, every risk, and every product into a single long-term worldview. Jensen Huang rarely framed it as a slogan, but the company lived by it: accelerated computing. The belief that parallelism, specialization, and full-stack integration would define the future of computation. This wasn't a marketing phrase. It was an operating system for how NVIDIA moved through the world. Accelerated computing meant one thing: don't compete in commodity markets. Don't chase trends other companies already understand. Instead, build systems, chips, software, tools, networking, that solved problems too complex for general-purpose processors. While the rest of the industry optimized for incremental performance gains, NVIDIA optimized for exponential leaps in speed. While competitors tried to win on price, NVIDIA tried to win on architecture. And Jensen knew that architecture, once adopted at scale, becomes extremely difficult to replace. What makes this philosophy unusual is its time horizon. Most companies think in cycles of 3 to 5 years. Jensen thinks in decades. He isn't interested in markets that already exist. He wants the ones that should exist, but don't. Yet. This approach is uncomfortable because it forces the company to make decisions long before the revenue arrives. CUDA took years. Data center GPUs took years. AI acceleration took years. But each bet was aligned with the same belief. The world would eventually demand far more compute than CPUs could provide. And that is why NVIDIA's strategy always goes beyond hardware. Jensen understood that a chip alone is not a moat. What matters is the ecosystem built around it. The compilers, libraries, models, frameworks, networking layers, and systems integration. He wanted NVIDIA to own the entire computing stack, from the silicon to the software to the supercomputer. That vertical integration created a powerful advantage. Once a developer built on NVIDIA, switching became almost impossible. This wasn't about locking customers in. It was about enabling them to build what no other platform could support. Whether it was climate simulation, robotics, medical imaging, or deep learning, the workloads kept growing more complex. And NVIDIA kept meeting them with a full-stack approach that no other competitor attempted at the same scale. The company wasn't chasing demand, it was shaping it, making markets instead of entering them. The result was a strategy that felt almost paradoxical. Move aggressively, but think patiently. Build fast, but aim far. Bet on technologies with no immediate payoff, but stay disciplined enough to survive the wait. This is why NVIDIA's competitors often miscalculated the company. They saw only the chips, not the decades-long philosophy behind them. And as the world approached the next major technological shift, Jensen's strategy began to reveal its full weight. Accelerated computing was no longer a theoretical future. It was becoming a necessity. The workloads were exploding. The data was multiplying. And a new form of intelligence, one that demanded unprecedented compute, was quietly emerging. NVIDIA had spent years preparing for a moment no one else truly expected. Jensen's philosophy wasn't just about building faster hardware. It was about understanding where the world was headed long before the world understood itself. This mindset would soon collide with one of the most transformative breakthroughs in modern history, the rise of artificial intelligence. And when it did, NVIDIA would be standing exactly where it needed to be. The rise of artificial intelligence didn't happen in a single moment. It built slowly, through research papers, experiments, and breakthroughs that most of the world ignored. But between 2012 and 2016, something shifted. Deep learning models, neural networks once dismissed as academic curiosities, began outperforming traditional algorithms on tasks that mattered: vision, speech, translation, pattern recognition. And these models had one defining characteristic. They demanded compute on a scale CPUs could not deliver. This was the moment CUDA had been quietly preparing for. Researchers started experimenting with NVIDIA GPUs, not because of marketing, but because they needed raw parallelism. A single neural network could involve millions, sometimes billions of parameters, each requiring repeated, simultaneous computation. CPUs could only process these steps sequentially. GPUs, by contrast, could handle thousands of operations at once. Suddenly, the architecture built for games revealed its power for intelligence. What began as a tool for rendering graphics became the preferred engine for training neural networks. AI labs like Google Brain, DeepMind, OpenAI, and university research groups began adopting NVIDIA GPUs as their default choice. Not because they were cheap, but because they worked. CUDA allowed researchers to write code directly optimized for parallel execution, while NVIDIA's ecosystem provided the tools, libraries, and drivers required for stable, scalable training. This combination, hardware plus software plus developer support, created a breakthrough moment. For the first time, the computational barrier to AI experimentation began to fall. As neural networks grew more complex, the demand for more powerful GPUs surged. NVIDIA responded with a series of chips engineered specifically for data centers and AI workloads, the V100, then the A100, and later the H100. These weren't gaming products repurposed for research. They were purpose-built for a world moving toward machine intelligence. Each generation multiplied performance, reduced training time, and expanded the scale at which models could be built. Companies across the globe began reconfiguring their infrastructure around NVIDIA's stack. Cloud services integrated GPU clusters. Universities built AI supercomputers. Robotics labs, biotech firms, and autonomous vehicle developers followed the same pattern. The more the world experimented with AI, the deeper it became intertwined with NVIDIA technology. Jensen's long-term intuition, the belief that GPUs would one day run the world's compute, was no longer a hypothesis. It was reality. By the early 2020s, NVIDIA had become the backbone of the AI revolution. Training a state-of-the-art neural network without NVIDIA hardware became nearly impossible. Entire industries, from recommendation engines to protein folding, relied on GPU acceleration. And the company's chips were no longer just components. They were infrastructure, the digital equivalent of railroads and power grids, enabling a generation of AI breakthroughs that reshaped global capabilities. What makes this chapter extraordinary is not just NVIDIA's success, but the symmetry of its journey. The bet on CUDA, dismissed as unnecessary, became the foundation. The struggles of the gaming era became preparation. The full-stack strategy became an ecosystem. And Jensen's philosophy of accelerated computing became the engine of modern intelligence. AI didn't make NVIDIA successful. NVIDIA made AI possible at scale. And that shift positioned the company at the center of the most transformative technological wave since the birth of the internet. By the time NVIDIA became central to the AI boom, a deeper question emerged across the industry. Why couldn't anyone catch up? Competitors had resources, teams, funding, and access to the same research papers. Yet year after year, the performance gap kept widening. To understand this, you have to look beyond the chip and into the architecture of NVIDIA's moat, a structure built patiently over decades, where every piece reinforces the next. The first element is CUDA. What began as a controversial experiment evolved into the most important software ecosystem in high-performance computing. Over 1 million developers rely on CUDA's libraries, compilers, and tools. Universities teach it. Research papers depend on it. Entire workflows have been built around it. This creates something competitors can't replicate quickly: momentum. Switching away from CUDA isn't just inconvenient, it means rewriting years of code, retraining teams, and rebuilding entire pipelines. The lock-in isn't artificial, it's earned through utility. The second advantage sits inside the world's most influential AI frameworks. TensorFlow, PyTorch, JAX, all of them are optimized first and deepest for NVIDIA GPUs. Not because of favoritism, but because NVIDIA provided early, consistent support for researchers. If a new algorithm emerged in a lab, NVIDIA's teams often worked directly with scientists to optimize it. This created a feedback loop where innovation and hardware evolved together. Competitors were always reacting, never leading.
Then there's the supply chain, a moat far more strategic than it appears. Jensen built a relationship with TSMC rooted not just in access, but partnership. NVIDIA secured priority for advanced process nodes, enabling them to design chips that hit performance levels others struggled to match. But the advantage wasn't only silicon. It extended to networking hardware,
high-speed interconnects, memory systems, and the infrastructure required to scale GPUs into supercomputers. No other company built the stack this comprehensively. When people compare competitors to NVIDIA, they often focus on the chip alone, as if catching up requires simply designing a faster processor. But NVIDIA's moat isn't one layer, it's dozens. Developer ecosystems, software frameworks, tools, compilers, foundry partnerships, enterprise support, data center integration, even specialized networking like InfiniBand and NVLink. To compete with NVIDIA, you don't need one breakthrough. You need many, across disciplines that move at different speeds. This is why even well-funded companies struggle. They can build a fast chip, but they can't instantly create a global network of researchers already trained on NVIDIA. They can't ship overnight a decade of optimized libraries. They can't rebuild the accumulated trust that labs and enterprises place in a platform proven across thousands of applications. NVIDIA isn't just ahead, it's entrenched. The irony is that none of this was designed as a defensive strategy. Jensen didn't build a moat to keep competitors out. He built a complete ecosystem because the workloads demanded it, because innovation needed it. The moat was the byproduct of doing the hard things early, consistently, and with long-term conviction. And this is why, even as new players enter the AI hardware space, the gap remains wide. NVIDIA is not simply a chip company. It is the operating system of accelerated computing, and moats built through decades of alignment are rarely undone by short bursts of competition. Leadership in technology is often portrayed as charisma, bravado, or relentless aggression. Jensen Huang operates differently. His presence is steady, almost understated, built on a philosophy of discipline rather than spectacle. Inside NVIDIA, he is known not for giving fiery speeches, but for being intensely, almost obsessively, close to the product. He reviews architectures, challenges design assumptions, debates engineering trade-offs, not as a distant CEO, but as someone fluent in every layer of the stack. This hands-on approach doesn't scale easily, yet somehow, under Jensen, it does. What stands out most is his emotional stability. Markets rise, products fail, competitors attack, but Jensen's demeanor rarely shifts. Employees describe him as consistent to a fault, someone who maintains the same tone in crisis as he does in victory. That steadiness creates a cultural signal. Panic is unproductive, noise is irrelevant, and the only thing worth focusing on is the work. In a world where tech leadership often oscillates between extremes, Jensen's calm becomes a competitive advantage. He also carries an unusual patience for high-risk bets. Most CEOs avoid uncertain investments that may take years to validate. Jensen embraces them. CUDA, data center GPUs, AI accelerators, all were multi-year commitments with no guarantee of success. His willingness to absorb long stretches of doubt without altering direction is rare. It reflects a mindset shaped by engineering, where complex systems demand time, iteration, and quiet belief long before the world sees the results. Even his personal style communicates this philosophy. The black leather jacket, simple, consistent, minimal, has become an unspoken signal. No theatrics, no reinvention for the sake of attention. It reflects a leader who values continuity over flash. In a way, it mirrors NVIDIA's strategy. Stay focused, stay disciplined, stay aligned with the long path forward. His persona isn't an image, it's an extension of his thinking. Employees often mention another trait, clarity. Jensen doesn't drown teams in motivational messages or abstract visions. He articulates direction with precision, the problem, the constraints, the opportunity. His communication style resembles that of a researcher explaining a hypothesis, not a CEO trying to inspire a crowd. And that clarity flows downward, shaping how NVIDIA operates. Decisions become structured, teams become deliberate, ambiguity is reduced. Perhaps the most defining element of Jensen's leadership is consistency. Whether NVIDIA is struggling or soaring, he behaves the same. Whether a bet is paying off or still uncertain, he maintains course. That consistency builds trust, both internally and externally. People know what to expect. They know the company won't pivot erratically. They know that each decision ties back to a long-term philosophy crafted over decades. In a world where many leaders chase quarterly trends or public validation, Jensen stands out by moving in the opposite direction. He operates slowly when the world expects speed, intensely when the world expects caution, and thoughtfully when the world expects noise. His leadership doesn't generate headlines, but it generates results. And that difference helps explain why NVIDIA's trajectory feels less like a series of lucky breaks and more like the outcome of decades of disciplined, intentional guidance. Today, NVIDIA stands among the most valuable and influential companies in the world, a position that feels inevitable in hindsight, but was anything but guaranteed. What began as a small startup in a diner now shapes the computational fabric of modern society. From AI supercomputers to autonomous vehicles, from robotics labs to cloud data centers, NVIDIA hardware has become the silent infrastructure behind a new technological era. Its chips don't just power applications, they enable entire industries to exist. The company's data center business, once a speculative gamble, is now one of the most critical pillars of global AI development. Every major AI lab, from Silicon Valley to Europe to Asia, relies on NVIDIA's GPU clusters to train models that influence everything from medicine to finance to entertainment. The A100 and H100 families, massive processors engineered for parallel intelligence, are now considered essential equipment, the modern equivalent of industrial machinery powering innovation across continents. This scale has elevated Jensen Huang into a rare category of leadership. He isn't simply a successful CEO. He has become one of the most respected strategic thinkers in technology, often mentioned alongside figures who shaped entire industries. His ability to anticipate long-term trends, allocate resources accordingly, and maintain composure through volatility has earned him a reputation as someone who sees around corners. Investors study his decisions. Competitors track his moves. Researchers follow his roadmap. What's striking is how pervasive NVIDIA's influence has become. Robotics companies depend on NVIDIA's platforms to build perception and control systems. Automakers use the company's hardware for autonomous driving. Data centers across the world rely on its GPUs to accelerate search, recommendation engines, large-scale simulations, and machine learning workloads. Even scientific fields, climate modeling, genomics, physics, chemistry, now rely on NVIDIA technology to achieve breakthroughs once deemed impossible. This reach isn't the result of aggressive expansion. It is the byproduct of building the right tools at the right moment, guided by a philosophy that stayed consistent while the world shifted. Jensen didn't chase these markets. They gravitated toward the infrastructure NVIDIA had already built. And that alignment has transformed the company into something bigger than a hardware provider. It has become an enabler of global progress. As AI continues to accelerate, NVIDIA's role grows even more pivotal. The world's most advanced models, simulations, and intelligence systems are trained on NVIDIA hardware. The company's roadmap shapes how fast the frontier of AI moves, how powerful future systems become, and how far computation can scale. Few companies hold this level of influence over the trajectory of technology. From a modest childhood in Taiwan to the center of the global AI race, Jensen's journey represents a rare convergence of engineering discipline, long-term strategy, and relentless consistency. And as NVIDIA stands at the heart of modern computation, its influence continues to expand. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet confidence that has defined Jensen's leadership from the beginning. When you trace Jensen Huang's journey from a modest childhood in Taiwan to the center of the global AI revolution, a pattern emerges, one built not on luck, but on discipline. His story shows that the world doesn't reward noise, It rewards clarity. It rewards those who think in decades, not quarters. And it rewards those who commit to a path long before the results arrive. NVIDIA's rise wasn't a series of explosive breakthroughs. It was a sequence of deliberate steps, aligned under a philosophy that never wavered. What began as an improbable bet on 3D graphics became the cornerstone of accelerated computing. What began as CUDA, a misunderstood project many dismissed, became the operating system of modern AI. And what began as a tiny team in a diner grew into one of the most influential companies on the planet. If there is a lesson here, it isn't about ambition or even innovation. It's about conviction, the kind that holds steady through failures, market skepticism, and years of silence. The kind that focuses not on what exists, but on what must exist for the future to unfold. For entrepreneurs, Jensen's path offers a blueprint. Bet on trends before they're visible. Build where others doubt. Combine hardware and software to create ecosystems, not products. And above all, stay consistent. NVIDIA succeeded not by being louder or faster, but by being relentlessly aligned in architecture, in philosophy, in execution. Every risk was tied to a long-term thesis. Every failure was treated as information. Every success was reinvested into the next horizon. This is how industries are shaped, slowly, intentionally, invisibly at first, then suddenly all at once. And yet, none of this happened through optimism alone. It happened through endurance, the kind Jensen learned early in life, washing dishes, adapting to a new country, working through uncertainty. These experiences built the internal architecture he would later rely on during NVIDIA's most difficult years. The company survived because its leader understood how to navigate ambiguity without losing direction. That is a rare skill, and one that separates those who build technologies from those who build eras. Today, as AI accelerates into every industry, NVIDIA stands not just as a participant, but as the backbone. Its chips power the training of the world's most advanced models. Its software guides scientific breakthroughs. Its architecture influences the pace of global innovation. And at the center of this transformation is a philosophy forged decades earlier, that computing must be accelerated, that ecosystems matter, and that real progress requires patience measured in decades. Jensen Huang didn't just build a company. He built a trajectory for where the world was headed, long before the world realized it. And his journey is a reminder that the future doesn't belong to the loudest voices or the boldest claims. It belongs to those who think clearly, act consistently, and commit fully. If this lens on business and technology resonates with you, consider subscribing. The deeper we study the people who shape our world, the better we understand the forces guiding its future.